Hello. Tonight we begin at the very edge of memory, long before anyone thought to call it a road. Picture the slow turning of the earth 2,000 years ago. The sun has just cleared the eastern horizon, brushing gold across the yellow Los hills of northern China. In the far west, beyond mountains most people will never see, the same sun sinks into the Tyrrhenian Sea, painting the marble columns of Rome in the color of dying embers. Between these two lights stretch thousands of miles of steppe, desert, and high pass empty, or so it seems. Yet already, something invisible moves along those empty spaces. Not armies this time. Not yet. Something quieter. A thread. In the Han court at Chang'an, officials speak in low voices about a mysterious fabric that arrives folded inside cedar boxes from the distant west. They call it sea silk. The character they write for it shows a cocoon beside a worm, simple lines that hide an entire guarded secret. To the men and women who wear it in the palace, silk feels like water made solid, cool against summer skin, warm when the wind turns sharp in autumn. No one in that room has ever seen the mulberry groves of the south where the worms are fed, or the women who carefully unspool the filaments under lamplight. Fewer still know that the same shimmering cloth has reached the tables of Parthian nobles in Ctesiphon, and even the villas on the Palatine Hill in Rome. They only know the price keeps rising, and that the fabric arrives wrapped in layer after layer of rumor. Rome, on the other side of the world, has its own name for this marvel: Sericum. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, complains about it with the irritation of a man who cannot understand why something so useless costs so much. The Seres, he calls the faraway people who make it, a race of strange habits who comb trees for wool. He has never met anyone who has actually travelled there, and neither has anyone else in the forum. The senators who drape themselves in translucent tunics know only that the stuff comes from beyond the edge of the map, carried first by one set of hands, then another, each trader taking his cut and adding his own story. By the time a bolt reaches Alexandria or Antioch, the original cocoon is as distant as a dream. Parthia sits in the middle, neither east nor west, but very much aware of both. The Parthian kings control the caravan cities strung along the Iranian plateau, Hekatompilos, Ecbatana, Rage, and they understand the value of distance. They do not produce silk. They do not need to. They simply make sure that no Chinese envoy speaks directly to a Roman merchant, and no Roman procurator ever learns the true source of the thread. A Parthian middleman buys raw silk at the eastern frontier near Merv, carries it west on Bactrian camels, sells it at a handsome profit in Seleucia on the Tigris, and smiles when the buyer asks where it really comes from. From the land of the Seres, he says, and lets the word hang like smoke. The less said, the higher the price. So the great empires Han, Parthia, Rome exist in the same century, command armies of hundreds of thousands, mint coins stamped with the faces of their rulers, yet they know almost nothing of one another. A Han courtier might hear the name Dakin Great Chin and picture a land of towering cities and strange customs, but he has no map that shows Italy. A Roman geographer like Strabo mentions the Sinai far to the east, near where cinnamon grows, but the information is second-hand, filtered through Arab and Indian sailors who never went inland. Parthia, meanwhile, prefers it this way. Ignorance is profitable, and yet the silk keeps moving. Not in great fleets or guarded convoys, at least not yet, but in small, cautious packets. A merchant from Sogdia buys a few rolls in Dunhuang, carries them across the Pamirs to Bactria, trades them for lapis and carnelian, then hands the silk to another man who will take it as far as the Euphrates. Each link in the chain knows only the next oasis, the next toll post, the next buyer willing to pay. No one travels the whole distance, no one needs to. The road does not exist as a single path. It is a network of habits, a chain of small decisions repeated season after season. A Bactrian camel driver stops at the same well he stopped at last year. A Kushan toll collector waves through the same family of traders he waved through the year before. Slowly, without anyone planning it, the habits harden into roots. Imagine standing on the western edge of the Taklamakan at dusk. The sand is still warm underfoot, but the air has already begun to cool. You hear the soft clink of camel bells long before you see the caravan. The animals move in single file, heads low, each step deliberate. Their drivers wrap their faces against the dust, leaving only the eyes visible. They do not speak much. There is no need. The route is known. Somewhere ahead lies the next walled town, the next market where someone will ask for silk and pay in silver or glass beads from the Mediterranean. Somewhere far behind, in a Han commandery, an official will open a ledger and record that another consignment of Western goods has left the frontier. Neither man will ever meet, neither needs to. This is the world before the road had a name. 3 great powers, Han China, Parthian Iran, Imperial Rome, each brilliant in its own basin of light, each surrounded by darkness they rarely crossed. Silk was the slender thread that reached from one pool of lamplight to another, passing through dozens of hands, growing more expensive and more legendary with every mile. No general ordered it. No treaty demanded it. It simply flowed, carried by men who cared more about survival and profit than about empires. The irony is gentle but real. While emperors in Chang'an dreamed of pacifying the northern nomads, while Parthian horsemen drilled for the next clash with Roman legions, while senators in Rome debated the morality of wearing something so scandalously thin, a quiet commerce continued across the emptiness. It carried not only silk but also glass, jade, furs, coral, saffron, and stories that grew taller the farther they traveled. A Roman might hear that the Ceres were giants who lived to be 200 years old. A hand scribe might copy down a report claiming that Dakin possessed birds that could speak, and trees that bore wool instead of leaves. Neither side corrected the other. The distance was too great, and the profit too good. Yet even in this age of separation, the first faint signs of connection were already appearing. A few Han coins have been found in Parthian graves. A piece of Roman glass has turned up in a Chinese tomb near Luoyang. Small, accidental proofs that the intermediaries were doing their work too well. The world was larger than anyone realized, but it was also smaller than anyone feared. Threads were crossing the dark. And so we leave this first quiet chapter with the image of a single roll of silk, wrapped in coarse cloth to protect it from sand and sweat, resting on the hump of a kneeling camel at the edge of a desert night. Somewhere to the east, the mulberry leaves are being gathered for next spring's cocoons. Somewhere to the west, a Roman lady is already planning the dinner at which she will wear her newest gown. Neither knows the other exists, but the silk knows. It has already begun its long journey between them. Now rest your eyes for a moment. Let the firelight or the screen light grow soft. When you are ready, we will follow the first man who was sent to see what lay beyond the horizon. That single roll of silk, resting on the camel's back under a desert sky turning indigo, would wait many more seasons before anyone thought to follow its path in reverse. For a long time, the movement remained one way east to west, in small guarded packets, through hands that never met their final buyers. Then, in the 2nd century before our era, something changed. Not a merchant decided to travel farther. Not a caravan master grew bold. It was an emperor who grew worried. In Chang'an, Emperor Wu of Han Wudi had come to the throne in 141 BCE, determined to end the long humiliation of tribute payments to the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were not a single tribe, but a confederation of nomadic groups whose horsemen raided the northern frontier. Almost every year the grass was good enough for their herds. They took silk, grain, princesses in marriage alliances, and left burned villages behind. Wudi wanted allies who could strike them from the other side. Rumors had reached the court that far to the west, beyond the Tarim Basin, lived a people called the Yuezhi. Once they had controlled the Gansu corridor, the Xiongnu had driven them out a generation earlier. If the Yuezhi still nursed a grudge, perhaps they could be persuaded to join Han against their old enemy. Wudi needed someone to find them, speak to their leaders, and bring back reliable information. He did not need a trader. He needed a diplomat who could survive. The man chosen was Zhang Qian. We know little about his early life, probably a low-ranking official or military officer from the northwest. What matters is that in 138 BCE, he accepted the mission. He was given a small party, perhaps 100 men, including a Xiongnu guide who had surrendered to Han forces and knew something of the routes north of the river. They carried credentials in the form of a yak-tail standard, the symbol of imperial authority. They also carried gift silk, of course, because silk opened doors even among nomads who had no mulberry trees. No one expected the journey to be quick. No one expected it to be safe. They crossed the frontier near Dunhuang, then still a rough outpost, and entered the Gobi. Almost at once they were seen. Xiongnu scouts moved faster than any Han column. Within days, Jiang Qian's party was surrounded, disarmed, and taken north to the Chanyu's camp. The Chanyu probably Junchen did not kill them. He had no reason to. Instead, he kept Jiang Qian prisoner for 10 years. During that time, Jiang Qian married a Xiongnu woman and had a son. He learned their language, watched their seasonal movements, memorized the paths their herds followed between summer and winter pastures. He was treated more as a hostage of rank than as an enemy. Still, every day, he reminded himself why he had been sent. In the 10th year, he saw his chance. The Chanyu had died. The new ruler was distracted by internal rivalries. Jiang Qian slipped away with his wife, his son, and a few loyal retainers. They moved south, back toward the Tarim Basin, traveling light and avoiding the main trails. By then, the Yuezhi had migrated even farther west, across the Pamirs, into the fertile valleys of what is now northern Afghanistan and southern Central Asia. Jiang Qian followed them. He found the Yuezhi living in settled towns, no longer purely nomadic. Their king had grown fat on the tribute of local peoples and showed little interest in old scores against the Xiongnu. Jiang Qian spoke of alliance, of joint attacks, of Han wealth that could flow if the roads were open. The Yuezhi king listened politely. He gave food, shelter, and safe passage farther west. But he would not commit soldiers. The distance was too great, the Xiongnu still too strong, the memory of defeat still too fresh. Jiang Qian stayed among them for another year, learning what he could of their neighbors, their trade, their routes. From there he traveled south into Bactria Daxia, the Chinese called it, where Greek-speaking kings still ruled cities, founded by Alexander's successors. He saw markets where Indian spices sat beside Mediterranean glass and Parthian silver. He heard the name Angsi Parthia and understood that a powerful state sat between his own country and the even more distant west. He did not reach Parthia itself. He turned back before the next winter closed the passes. The return to Han territory took another year. By 126 BCE, 13 years after he left, Jiang Qian reached the court with only one surviving companion from the original party. His wife and son remained behind in the west. He never saw them again. He knelt before Emperor Wu and delivered his report. It was not what the emperor had hoped for. No alliance with the Yuezhi. No second front against the Xiongnu. But the information he brought was worth more than any military pact. Jiang Qian described vast, fertile lands in the west, cities with walls and markets, people who rode horses as well as the Xiongnu but farmed as well. He spoke of heavenly horses from Fergana tall, sweating blood when they ran, stronger and faster than the small steppe ponies Han cavalry relied on. He mentioned grapes that could be made into wine, alfalfa that could feed better horses, lucerne that grew thick in the river valleys. Most important, he described routes, strings of oases linked by known wells, mountain passes used by traders, tolls charged by local chiefs. These were not empty desert crossings. People lived there. They traded. They could be negotiated with. Emperor Wu listened. He did not send armies west, not yet. Instead, he sent more missions. Jiang Qian went again in 115 BCE, this time with 300 men, cattle, and far more gifts. He reached as far as the Wusun, a nomadic group allied loosely with the Yuezhi, and persuaded their ruler to accept a Han princess in marriage and send tribute horses. Other envoys followed. Some returned. Some disappeared, but each journey added detail to the map in Chang'an. Names of kings, distances in days of march, places where water could be found. places where it could not. These were not trading expeditions. The Han government still forbade private merchants from crossing the frontier without permission. The missions were official state reconnaissance, dressed as diplomacy. Yet wherever Han envoys went, they carried silk, and wherever silk went, merchants noticed. Local traders began to follow the same paths, offering protection to the official parties in exchange for a share of the gifts. Soon the gifts themselves, silk, iron tools, lacquer, became items for resale. The line between diplomacy and commerce blurred without anyone admitting it. Imagine the moment Zhang Qian first saw the snow peaks of the Pamirs rising in the distance. The air is thin, the sun sharp, even in late autumn. His small group stops at a stream to refill water skins. A caravan passes in the other direction, Bactrian camels loaded with hides and wool, drivers speaking a language he does not know. One of them glances at the Han yak-tail standard, nods once, and moves on. No words are exchanged, no need. The trail is there. It has carried others before them. It will carry others after. Zhang Qian died around 113 BCE, honored but not wealthy. His reports, however, lived on. They became the foundation for Han policy in the western regions. Garrisons were built at key oases. Agricultural colonies were established to supply the frontier posts. The Xiongnu were pushed back, not only by Han armies, but by the slow pressure of a state that now knew the geography beyond its borders. The scattered trails used for centuries by shepherds, refugees, small traders began to harden into something more permanent. Not a single highway, not yet, but a network of preferred routes, watched by Han outposts, used by both officials and the merchants who followed in their wake. And so the first threads were laid not by plan, not by commerce alone, but by a prisoner who spent 10 years listening, watching, remembering. When he finally returned, he brought back more than stories. He brought the knowledge that the emptiness between empires could be crossed, that people lived on the other side, that paths already existed if you knew where to look. As the last light fades from that high pass where Zhang Qian once stood, a new generation of travelers begins to move along the same route, some carrying imperial credentials, others carrying only their own ambition. The wind still rustles the dry grass. The trails are still fragile, but they are no longer quite so hidden. As the trails grew firmer under the feet of those early Han envoys, one detail from Zhang Qian's reports kept returning to Emperor Wu's mind: the horses. The Fergana Valley, he had learned, bred animals taller and stronger than anything the steppe or the northern plains could offer. Their coats shone red gold in the sun. Legend said they sweated blood when they galloped. The Chinese called them heavenly horses, tianma. To a cavalry-minded court, they were not luxury, but necessity. The Xiongnu still rode circles around Han forces on their hardy ponies. Better mounts could change that balance. So the Han turned diplomacy into demand. Beginning around 115 BCE, embassies arrived in Fergana, then called Daiyuan, with gifts of silk, gold, and lacquer, but also with a clear request: sell us your horses. The king of Daiyuan agreed at first, sending a few dozen fine stallions. The Han officers who received them were impressed. The animals were larger, faster, carried heavier loads without tiring. But the numbers were small. The king kept the best bloodlines for himself. When Han envoys pressed for more hundreds, even thousands, the response turned cold. Fergana was far from Chang'an. The king saw no reason to weaken his own cavalry to strengthen a distant empire. Emperor Wu did not accept refusal. In 104 BCE, he sent General Li Guangli west with an army of 60,000 men. The campaign was meant to be quick: march through the Tarim oases, cross the Pamirs, take the horse pastures by force if necessary. It was not quick. The supply lines stretched too thin. Local rulers closed their gates or demanded exorbitant tolls. Xiongnu raiders harassed the flanks. Li Guangli reached Fergana only to find the capital city well defended. After a long and costly siege, the Han army withdrew. 2 years later, in 102 BCE, Li returned with reinforcements. This time, The siege succeeded. The king was killed. A more compliant ruler was installed. Fergana agreed to send 2,000 of their best horses every year, plus 3,000 ordinary ones. The heavenly horses began to arrive in Chang'an. Those animals transformed Han cavalry. Crossbred with local stock, they produced mounts that could outrun and outlast the Xiongnu ponies in open battle. The northern frontier grew quieter. Han garrisons pushed farther west, establishing commanderies in the Tarim Basin. The routes Zhang Qian had described now carried not only diplomats, but regular military couriers, supply trains, and quietly merchants who tagged along under official protection. The state had created the conditions for safer travel. Without that protection, few would have risked the long crossings. Yet the Han could not control everything. Far to the west, Parthia held the central ground. The Parthian Empire, at its height under kings like Mithridates II and Phraates IV, stretched from Mesopotamia to the edges of Bactria. They controlled the caravan cities along the Iranian plateau Hekatompilos, Rage, Ekbatana, and the vital river crossings of the Tigris and Euphrates. Parthian cataphracts, armored heavy cavalry, could block any army that tried to march straight from China to Rome. But Parthia did not block trade. They taxed it. Every caravan paid duties at frontier posts. Every merchant paid for safe passage through Parthian territory. The kings understood that silk, spices, and precious stones were worth more alive than dead. So they let the goods flow, but they made sure no direct contact developed between Han envoys and Roman procurators. When a Chinese mission reached the Parthian border, it was met with polite hospitality and firm refusal to go farther. Parthian middlemen took the silk, sold it onward to Roman Syria, and kept the profits. The empire acted as a deliberate filter, profitable and secure. Then, in the space between Han expansion and Parthian control, a new power rose. Around the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Yuezhi whom Zhang Qian had visited decades earlier consolidated their hold over Bactria and northern India. Under their leader Kujula Kadphises and his successor Vima Kadphises, they created the Kushan Empire. By the 1st century CE, it stretched from the Oxus River south to the Ganges Plain, east toward the Tarim Basin, west almost to Parthia's frontier. The Kushans were originally nomads, but they quickly adopted the settled ways of the lands they ruled. They minted gold coins stamped with Greek, Persian, and Indian deities side by side. They built cities, patronized monasteries, guarded passes. The Kushans mattered to the Silk Road because they bridged regions no single earlier power had fully joined. They controlled the routes south of the Pamirs and Hindu Kush, linking the Tarim oases directly to the Indian subcontinent. Buddhist monks traveled north from Gandhara, carrying sutras and relics. Silk and jade moved south in return. Kushan tolls were lighter than Parthia's in some places, their armies more welcoming to merchants. Under Kanishka, who ruled in the early 2nd century CE, the empire reached its peak. Trade flourished. Caravans moved without constant fear of raid or blockade. The Kushans did not invent the routes, but they stabilized them. This is the quiet truth of those centuries. The Silk Road could not have become what it did without strong empires holding the ground. A single oasis town might welcome traders for a season, but without a larger authority to punish bandits, enforce contracts, or maintain wells and roads, the traffic would have stayed small and sporadic. The Han provided security in the east, building walls, digging canals, stationing garrisons that supplied fodder and water. Parthia policed the middle, turning potential invasion routes into taxed highways. The Kushans bridged the south, connecting overland paths to the riches of India and opening new branches. Each empire had its own reasons: military advantage, tax revenue, prestige, but together they created the stability that let merchants risk the long journey year after year. Without that scaffolding of power, the threads would have remained thin, easily snapped by drought, raid, or simple fear. Empires did not plan the Silk Road. They did not draw maps of a grand highway. But by wanting horses, wanting tribute, wanting control, they unintentionally wove the fragile web that held it together. So picture now a Han officer standing beside a newly arrived Fergana stallion in the stables outside Chang'an. The horse snorts, shakes its mane, stamps against the packed earth. Somewhere far to the west, a Parthian customs official weighs a bale of silk on bronze scales. In a Kushan market at Taxila, a merchant counts gold dinars beside a Buddhist stupa. None of them knows the other's names. None needs to. The empires have done their work. The paths are open. The next caravans are already forming under the same golden haze. And as those first heavenly horses settle into their new pastures, the routes they helped secure begin to carry more than silk and soldiers. Ideas, religions, technologies start to move along the same trails, carried in the packs of men who follow where power has made it possible to go. As those first heavenly horses settled into their new pastures and the routes grew steadier under imperial protection, the places where caravans paused began to change. What had once been mere watering holes or clusters of mud brick shelters grew into proper towns. They were not the capitals of empires or the birthplaces of great dynasties. They were stops necessary, profitable, and strangely permanent in a landscape that otherwise shifted with every sandstorm. 4 of them stand out across the centuries: Dunhuang at the eastern gate, Kashgar at the western edge of the Tarim, and in between, farther west still, Samarkand and Bukhara on the Iranian side of the divide. Each one became a knot where threads from every direction met and knotted tighter. Dunhuang sits where the Hexi corridor opens onto the Taklamakan desert. In Han times, it was a military outpost, one of 4 commanderies planted to anchor the frontier. By the early centuries CE, it had walls, granaries, a market square, and a steady stream of officials coming and going. But its real importance lay in location. To the east lay the long, safe road back to Chang'an. To the west stretched 2 branches around the desert. The northern route hugging the Tian Shan foothills through Hami and Turfan, the southern hugging the Kunlun through Miran and Khotan. Caravans had to choose one or split here. Water was reliable, fed by the Dang River from the Kilian Mountains, so merchants rested, repaired packs, traded goods, hired new guides. The town grew wealthy on the traffic it did not create, but simply enabled. A short distance southeast of the walls lie the Mogao Caves. They began as small meditation cells cut into a sandstone cliff around the 4th century CE, when Buddhist monks from Central Asia and northern China sought quiet places to practice. Over the next 900 years, donors, merchants, officials, local families paid for larger caves, filling them with painted walls and painted statues. The frescoes show scenes from the Buddha's life, but also donors in their finest clothes. Chinese robes, Sogdian tunics, even occasional figures with distinctly Iranian features. One cave holds a library sealed around 1000 CE, thousands of scrolls in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Uyghur, Sogdian, even a few in Hebrew and Syriac. The caves were not hidden, they were public. Travelers stopped to pray, to leave offerings, to commission a new image for safe passage ahead. Faiths met here under one wall. Buddhist sutras beside Zoroastrian motifs, Manichaean hymns copied near Nestorian Christian crosses, because the town itself was a crossroads, and the caves simply reflected that. Move west along the northern route and you reach Kashgar. It sits at the junction where the Tarim Basin meets the Pamir Plateau. From here paths fork. One climbs south over high passes toward India, another continues west toward Fergana and Sogdia. Kashgar controlled both. Its market was famous for jade from Khotan, carpets from the steppe, spices carried up from the south. The old town was built of sun-dried brick, streets narrow and shaded, bazaars loud with the calls of traders speaking a dozen languages. Camels knelt in courtyards while men unloaded bales of silk, bolts of cotton, ingots of copper. The ruler, sometimes independent, sometimes tributary to a larger power, collected tolls and offered protection. In return, the town thrived. Mosques rose beside older Buddhist stupas. Caravanserais provided beds, baths, and secure storage. Kashgar was never the final destination for most goods. It was the place where you changed animals, hired fresh drivers, sold part of your load, and bought the next leg's merchandise. Farther west still, across the high passes and down into the fertile Zarafshan Valley, lie Samarkand and Bukhara. These were older cities, with roots in the Achaemenid period and memories of Alexander. By the time the Silk Road routes matured, they were the beating heart of Sogdia. Samarkand sat on the main east-west artery. Its walls enclosed orchards, canals, and a citadel that overlooked the market. Sogdian merchants, shrewd, multilingual, often acting as agents for larger networks, dominated the trade here. They carried silk west to the Mediterranean, but also brought back glass, wool, coral, and silver coins that circulated as far as China. Bukhara, a day's march west, was smaller but no less vital. It controlled the crossing of the Zarafshan and the routes north to the steppe. Both cities had quarters for foreign traders, Indian, Chinese, Persian, even occasional Arabs. Temples, fire altars, churches, and later mosques stood close together. A single street might hear prayers in Sanskrit, Avestan, Syriac, and early Persian. The cities grew rich, not because they produced much themselves, though they had fine paper, melons, and metalwork, but because they were safe places to rest, repair, and redistribute. What all four shared was a simple fact. They were nodes, not ends. No caravan set out from Chang'an, aiming only for Dunhuang. No merchant crossed the Pamirs just to reach Kashgar. The cities existed to keep movement alive. They offered water where the desert gave none, walls where raiders might strike, markets where you could sell what you carried and buy what you needed next. A trader from Luoyang might leave silk at Dunhuang, pick up jade or horses, carry them to Kashgar, trade for cotton or spices, then hand the load to a Sogdian who would take it towards Samarkand. Each city took its cut tolls, lodging fees, brokers' commissions, but each also reduced the risk of the next stage. Without these knots, the threads would have frayed and snapped long before reaching their markets. And beneath the commerce ran something quieter, the meeting of beliefs. In the Mogao caves, on the walls of Kashgar's older shrines, in the fire temples and stupas of Sogdia, people of different faiths stood side by side. A Buddhist monk from India might share a caravanserai courtyard with a Zoroastrian merchant from Persia and a Nestorian trader carrying letters from Syria. They did not always agree. They did not need to. The road demanded tolerance because the road demanded survival. A man who refused to sell water or grain to a stranger of another creed would soon find his own goods unsold. So these oases under the stars were more than stops. They were the places where the long journey became bearable, where strangers became regular customers, where faiths borrowed from one another without losing their names. The Silk Road was not a single line drawn on a map. It was a living chain of these towns, each glowing for a while in the dark, each holding the web together just long enough for the next caravan to pass through. As the lamps dim in a Bukhara caravanserai and the last trader closes his ledger, the night settles over the same starlit sands. Somewhere to the south, under different skies, another branch of the same web begins to stir paths that reach toward India and the warm waters beyond. As the starlit sands gave way to the first hints of dawn along those southern routes toward India, the center of gravity on the Silk Road had already begun to shift eastward. The Han Empire had long since fractured into the chaos of the Three Kingdoms and the brief unity of the Jin, followed by centuries of division in the north and south. Then, in 618 CE, the Tang dynasty rose from the same northwestern heartland that had once sent Zhang Qian west. Under emperors like Taizong and Xuanzong, the Tang brought a level of openness, wealth, and confidence that turned the old frontier routes into arteries of a true golden age. Chang'an, the greatest city on earth at the time, grew to perhaps 1 million souls. Its walls enclosed broad avenues, foreign quarters, Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian churches, and Muslim mosques standing within sight of one another. The Eastern Market and Western Market buzzed from dawn until curfew. Merchants from as far as Arabia and Byzantium set up stalls beside Sogdians, Persians, Indians, Koreans, and Tibetans. Silk remained the flagship export, but now it travelled in greater volume and variety. Plain tabby, patterned damask, embroidered gauze, even painted screens. In return came glassware from the Mediterranean, lapis from Afghanistan, spices from South India, horses from the steppe, and silver dirhams that circulated as currency far into China. What made this flow possible was not only military security. Tang armies re-established control over the Tarim Basin and pushed garrisons as far as the Pamirs, but also a series of practical inventions that crossed the routes in both directions. Paper was one of the earliest and most transformative. Invented in China during the Han, but perfected under the Tang. It replaced cumbersome bamboo slips and expensive silk for record-keeping and books. By the 8th century, papermaking had spread to Samarkand after Tang prisoners captured at the Battle of Talas in 751 taught the technique to their Abbasid captors. From there it moved west to Baghdad and eventually Europe, changing how knowledge was stored and shared everywhere it went. Gunpowder followed a similar path, though more slowly and with greater consequence. Early Tang alchemists, experimenting with elixirs of immortality, mixed saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. By the 9th century, military engineers had weaponized the mixture into incendiary bombs and primitive grenades used against nomadic raiders. The formula leaked westward through Central Asian intermediaries, reaching the Islamic world by the 13th century, and Europe soon after. Stirrups, too, had Chinese roots appearing in tombs from the 4th century CE and spread west via steppe nomads and Sogdian traders, revolutionizing cavalry tactics from Persia to Frankish Europe. These were not isolated gifts. They were part of a steady two-way current. Silk and porcelain west, silver, spices and glass east, ideas and techniques in both directions. At the heart of this exchange stood the Sogdian merchants. They were not new to the trade, they had been active since at least the 4th century, but under Tang prosperity, they became the indispensable middlemen. Sogdia, the region around Samarkand and Bukhara, produced no great empire of its own after the Kushans, but its people spoke a language related to Persian, wrote in a script derived from Aramaic, and maintained family networks that stretched from China to the Black Sea. A single Sogdian house might have brothers in Chang'an, Tashkent, Merv, and Ctesiphon. They specialized in long-distance carriage, hiring camels, negotiating tolls, hedging currency fluctuations, and carrying letters of credit that functioned like early checks. Letters preserved in the Dunhuang Library show Sogdian traders writing home in their own language about prices, debts, and family news, even as they conducted business in Chinese or Persian. They carried more than goods. Sogdians translated Buddhist texts, Zoroastrian prayers, and Manichaean hymns. They introduced grape wine to the Tang court. Emperor Xuanzong reportedly enjoyed it, and brought back Chinese musical instruments that influenced Central Asian styles. Their communities in Chinese cities formed tight-knit guilds with their own temples and cemeteries. A famous letter from a Sogdian woman in Dunhuang complains about a delayed remittance from her husband in Samarkand. Another records a merchant's will, dividing camels, silk bales, and slaves among his heirs. These were ordinary people doing what merchants have always done, turning distance into profit, while carrying pieces of distant cultures along with their cargo. To make the journeys safer and more predictable, the Tang, and to some extent, their neighbors invested in infrastructure that still defines the road in memory, the caravanserais. These were fortified inns built at regular intervals along the main routes, often every 20 to 30 miles, the distance a laden camel could comfortably cover in a day. A typical caravanserai had thick mud brick walls, a central courtyard for unloading animals, covered stalls for camels and horses, private rooms for wealthier travelers, a communal kitchen, a well or cistern, and sometimes a small mosque or chapel. Guards watched the gates at night. Merchants paid a fee for lodging and security. In return, they could sleep without fear of theft or sudden raid. Some larger ones, like those near oases in the Tarim, included baths fed by hot springs and bazaars, where traders could sell or barter before moving on. The caravanserai turned the road into something almost routine. A merchant leaving Bukhara knew he could reach the next one before dark, find fodder for his animals, repair a broken pack saddle, and hear news from the east. The same system existed on the Tang side. Official postal stations doubled as rest houses for envoys and merchants under imperial license. Together, these way stations reduced the terror of the unknown. The desert remained dangerous: sandstorms, thirst, bandits, but it was no longer impassable. The beacons of light from caravanserai courtyards guided caravans across hundreds of miles of empty land. Under this Tang glow, the Silk Road reached a kind of maturity. Trade was larger in scale, more regular, more diverse. Goods, technologies, and beliefs moved with less friction than ever before. Sogdians bridged the linguistic and cultural gaps. Caravanserais bridged the physical ones. The Tang court provided the stability that made long-term investment worthwhile. It was not utopia. Wars still flared, tolls still rose, droughts still killed. But for several generations, the routes hummed with life. So as a Sogdian merchant settles his accounts by lamplight in a caravanserai near Turfan, counting silver coins from a Chinese buyer and packing the last of his silk for the westward leg, the night outside is calm. The camels chew their cud in the courtyard. Somewhere farther south, under warmer winds, other paths are branching toward the subcontinent and the sea routes beyond. Those southern branches have been there all along, quieter until now, but ready to carry their own share of the exchange. As the night settles over that caravanserai near Turfan and the merchant folds his ledger, the routes he has travelled so far represent only the northern and central branches of a much wider network. South of the great mountain barriers, the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, the Karakoram, another set of paths had long existed, quieter in the early centuries, but steadily growing in importance. These southern branches linked the Tarim Basin and Sogdia directly to the Indian subcontinent, carrying goods, ideas, and people under skies heavy with monsoon rain. The connection began in the time of the Kushans, whose empire already straddled the mountains. From their capital, at Purushapura, modern Peshawar, roads ran north through the Khyber, and Bolan passes to Bactria and the oases beyond, and south across the Punjab to the Ganges plain. Buddhist pilgrims and merchants used these routes regularly. By the Tang period, the traffic had thickened. Chinese monks travelled south, seeking original Sanskrit texts. Indian monks travelled north, carrying relics and images. The passes were steep and narrow, often blocked by snow in winter or mudslides in summer, but the rewards were worth the risk: pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, and cloves from the Malabar and Coromandel coasts, cotton textiles dyed in bright indigo, gems from Ceylon and the Deccan, and above all, Buddhist scriptures that Chinese scholars considered essential for completing their own translations. India exported more than spices. Buddhism itself had travelled these southern paths centuries earlier, carried by missionaries under Ashoka, and later by merchants and pilgrims. Under the Kushans and then the Gupta Empire, Gandhara and Mathura became centres of art and learning, where Greco-Roman, Persian, and Indian styles blended in statues of the Buddha. Monks like Faxian in the early 5th century and Xuanzang in the 7th crossed these routes in both directions. Xuanzang, in particular, spent years in India studying at Nalanda, copying texts, debating with scholars, and returning with hundreds of manuscripts packed on camels and elephants. Those texts, sutras, treatises on logic, medicine, astronomy, reached Chang'an and were translated into Chinese, shaping East Asian Buddhism for centuries. In return, Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea reached Indian ports, often carried by the same caravans that brought the scriptures north. These land routes did not stop at the edge of the subcontinent. They met the sea. From the ports of Baruch, Sopara, Muziris, and later Calicut and Cambay, Indian merchants sailed west to the Red Sea and east to Southeast Asia, while Arab, Persian, and later Chinese ships joined the trade. The Indian Ocean monsoon system made the timing predictable. Southwest winds in summer carried vessels from Africa and Arabia to India. Northeast winds in winter carried them back. A merchant could leave the Persian Gulf in spring, reach western India by summer, trade, then sail east or return with the changing winds. Overland caravans from Central Asia met these maritime routes at the Indus Delta or Gujarat. Silk bales unloaded at Kashgar or Balkh could reach a ship at Barbarakon or Barigaza within weeks, then continue to Alexandria or even Rome via the Red Sea and Nile canals. This merging of land and sea created a single, larger system. Goods did not choose between routes. They used whichever segment was fastest or safest at the time. A bale of Chinese silk might travel by camel from Chang'an to Dunhuang, then south through the Pamirs to Taxila, then by ox cart to the coast, then by Tao to Aden, then by camel again across Arabia to the Mediterranean. The same journey could skip segments if a sea leg was available. Spices from Kerala reached Sogdian markets in Samarkand via the same combined path, shipped to the Indus, then caravan north. Buddhist relics from Sri Lanka travelled overland to China. Chinese pilgrims sailed partway to India when the overland passes were closed. The two networks, Overland Silk Road and Maritime Spice Route, were not rivals. They were extensions of each other. The ports themselves became hybrid places. Muziris on the Malabar coast, described in the 1st century Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, had quarters for Yavanas, Greeks and Romans, Persians and Arabs. Later, under the Tang, Chinese junks appeared in Southeast Asian ports like Srivijaya, linking back to Guangzhou. But the true junction remained northern India and the passes. There Sogdian Kushan descended, and Indian traders handled the transfer. Silk for pepper, porcelain for cotton, manuscripts for jade. Tolls were paid to local rajas or to Kushan successors. Languages switched from Chinese to Prakrit, to Persian, to Greek loanwords. The system worked because everyone understood the logic. Move the goods, collect the fee, repeat. This southern connection completed the picture. The Silk Road was never just a single east-west line across deserts and steppes. It was a web with branches that dipped south to the warm seas, where wind and tide carried what camels could not. Land and water together formed one continuous exchange, each part supporting the other. Spices flavoured, Chang'an kitchens because of monsoon sales. Buddhist temples in Luoyang held Sanskrit originals because of mountain caravans. The two halves were inseparable. So as a caravan descends the last pass into the Punjab plain, the air grows thicker with the scent of rain and distant ocean salt. Somewhere ahead, under those monsoon skies, ships wait at anchor, holds already half filled with cinnamon and cloves. The land route ends here for now, but only to hand its cargo to the waves, where the journey continues without pause. As the monsoon clouds drift away and the southern paths hand their cargoes to waiting ships, the center of the old Silk Road network, those long steppe corridors and oasis chains, begins to feel a different kind of wind. By the early 13th century, the Tang order has long faded, replaced by smaller states in China, fractured khanates in Central Asia, and rising powers farther west. Trade continues, but the journeys are slower, more expensive, and far more dangerous. Bandits multiply where no single authority can punish them. Tolls turn arbitrary. Caravans shrink or stop altogether when rumors of war spread. Then, almost overnight, the map changes. In 1206, a man named Temujin takes the title Genghis Khan and unites the Mongol tribes under one standard. What follows is not gradual expansion, but a storm. Within 20 years, his armies have swept across northern China, destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, reached the Caspian Sea, and sent scouts into Eastern Europe. His successors Ogadai, Guyuk, Mungke, and Kublai pushed the boundaries farther. By the 1270s, the Mongol Empire stretches from the Pacific to the edges of Poland and Hungary, from Siberia to northern India. It is the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. This sudden unity creates something new, Pax Mongolica. The Mongols did not invent safe roads, they enforced them with ruthless efficiency. They established a system of yam stations postal relays every 20 to 30 miles, where fresh horses, food, and armed escorts waited for official couriers. Merchants quickly learned they could use the same network. A paisa, a small gold or silver tablet stamped with the Khan's seal, granted the bearer protection, free lodging at yam posts, and priority passage. Refuse service to a paisa holder, and the penalty was death. Local governors who extorted traders faced execution. Bandits who preyed on caravans were hunted down without mercy. For the first time in centuries, a merchant could travel from the Yellow River to the Black Sea, with reasonable confidence that he would arrive intact. The safety was real and measurable. Contemporary accounts, both Chinese and Persian, describe roads where a woman could walk alone carrying gold without fear. Taxes were standardized and often lower than under previous rulers. Wells were repaired, bridges rebuilt, pastures reserved for caravan animals. The Mongols themselves were nomads. They understood the steppe and desert better than settled empires ever had. They cleared the old toll barriers that had choked traffic and replaced them with a single, predictable system. Silk, spices, jade, furs, rhubarb, musk, and paper moved in larger volumes than before. In return came silver ingots from the west, glass from Syria, wool from the Caucasus, and coral from the Mediterranean. Into this briefly unified world steps Marco Polo. Born in Venice around 1254, he travels east with his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo, who had already made the journey once. They leave in 1271, cross Persia, reach the court of Kublai Khan in 1275, and remain in China for 17 years. Marco serves as an official, perhaps in the Salt administration, or as an inspector of provinces, learning Mongolian, Persian, and enough Chinese to navigate the bureaucracy. When he finally returns to Venice in 1295 via the southern sea route through Southeast Asia and India, he brings stories that astonish Europe. His account, dictated to Rustichello da Pisa, while both men are prisoners of war in Genoa, describes a China of wide canals, paper money, coal fires, and cities larger than anything in Italy. He speaks of the postal system that lets messages cross the empire in days instead of months. He mentions the safe roads, the yam stations, the absence of robbers. He describes Kublai's summer palace at Xanadu, the Grand Canal linking north and south, the use of paper currency backed by silk reserves. Whether every detail is exact, scholars still debate. Some claims the book captures the scale and order of the Mongol world. For Europeans, it is the first detailed glimpse of Cathay as a real place, not a legend. Marco Polo is only the most famous traveller of this era. Others moved more quietly. Rabban Sauma, a Nestorian monk born near Beijing, travels west in the 1280s as an envoy of the Ilkhanate court in Persia, reaching Rome, Paris, and London to propose an alliance against the Mamluks. Italian merchants, like the Vivaldi brothers, attempt the sea route around Africa. Chinese envoys reach Baghdad. Persian physicians serve in Kambalik. Franciscan friars, like Giovanni da Pian del Carpina and William of Rubruck, make the overland journey to the Mongol capital at Karakorum in the 1240s and 1250s, reporting back to the Pope. The roads are open in both directions. A merchant from Bukhara can reach Beijing. A Franciscan from Umbria can reach the Gobi. This period, roughly 1250 to 1350, is the safest chapter in the Silk Road's long history. No single empire before or after matched the Mongol ability to police such vast distances. The unity was brief, held together by family loyalty and military terror more than administration. But while it lasted, the old fears receded. Caravans grew longer. Merchants planned multi-year journeys instead of seasonal ones. Ideas moved freely. Gunpowder recipes refined in China reached the Middle East. Islamic astronomy influences Chinese calendars. European clocks inspire mechanical toys at the Khan's court. Yet even in this golden moment, the empire is not eternal. Succession disputes, overextension, and the sheer difficulty of ruling so many peoples begin to crack the structure. By the mid-14th century, the Khanates are drifting apart. The Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai in Central Asia. Trade continues, but the old guarantees weaken. So as Marco Polo's ship finally anchors in Venice, and he unpacks the last of his notes under a Mediterranean sun, the vast steppe stars still shine over roads that, for a few generations, belong to everyone and no one in particular. A world briefly made one is already beginning to separate again, and with it, the safest paths the Silk Road has ever known start to feel the first chill of coming division. As Marco Polo's ship anchors in Venice and the steppe stars fade behind new divisions, the unity that made those roads so safe begins to fray at the edges. The Mongol Khanates drift apart faster than anyone expected. The Yuan dynasty in China weakens under rebellions and floods. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapses into civil war after 1335. The Chagatai Khanate fragments into eastern and western halves. The Golden Horde holds longer, but loses control of its western frontiers. Without a central authority to enforce the yam system or punish local warlords, tolls rise again, escorts become unreliable, and banditry returns to the old levels. Caravans grow smaller and more cautious. Some merchants stop traveling the full distance and instead hand goods at midway points like Samarkand or Herat. The long journeys that once spanned the continent in relative safety now feel exposed once more. Then comes something far worse than political fracture. In the late 1330s, reports reached the Mongol court of a strange and deadly sickness moving west from the steppe. By 1346, it has reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, where Genoese traders are besieged by the Golden Horde. According to contemporary accounts, the besiegers catapult infected corpses over the walls, a crude form of biological warfare. Whether that act started the spread or merely accelerated it, the plague arrives in the Black Sea ports by 1347. From there it travels the familiar caravan routes in reverse, to Constantinople, to Alexandria, to Venice and Genoa, then inland across Europe. The same paths that once carried silk and spices now carry Yersinia pestis in the fleas of black rats that nest in grain sacks and camel packs. The Black Death moves with terrifying speed. In cities along the Silk Road, Bukhara, Samarkand, Tabriz mortality reaches 30 to 60% in a single season. Entire caravanserais empty as drivers and merchants fall ill and die on the road. Survivors abandon loads rather than risk infection. Trade contracts collapse because there are fewer buyers, fewer sellers, and fewer people left to carry anything at all. In China, the Yuan government, already strained, cannot collect taxes or maintain garrisons. In the Middle East, the plague weakens the Ilkhanate's remnants and clears the way for new powers. The overland routes do not stop entirely. Some resilient merchants still move small quantities of high-value goods, but the volume drops sharply. The old confidence evaporates. A journey that once promised profit now promises death. As the worst of the plague recedes by the 1360s, the Mongol world has changed beyond recognition. The Yuan fall in 1368 to the Ming dynasty, which turns inward, rebuilding the Great Wall and limiting foreign contact. Ming emperors discourage long-distance trade, preferring tribute missions that bring foreigners to the capital rather than letting Chinese merchants roam freely. In Central Asia, the Timurids rise under Timur Tamerlane, who conquers from Delhi to Anatolia in brutal campaigns that destroy cities like Herat and Isfahan. Timur dies in 1405, and his empire fragments almost immediately. The roads remain, but they are contested by competing warlords. Safety becomes a local matter again, not an imperial guarantee. Into this vacuum steps the Ottoman state. Founded in the late 13th century as a small beylik in northwestern Anatolia, the Ottomans expand steadily after the plague. They capture Bursa in 1326, cross into Europe at Gallipoli in 1354, take Adrianople in 1361, and finally conquer Constantinople in 1453 under Mehmed II. The fall of the Byzantine capital closes the traditional land bridge between Europe and Asia Minor for Western merchants. The Ottomans control the straits, the eastern Mediterranean ports, and much of the overland route through Anatolia and into Syria. They tax trade heavily, but also protect it within their borders. Caravans still cross from Persia to the Ottoman Levant, but the old freedom of the Mongol era is gone. Tolls are higher, permissions more bureaucratic, and the route now funnels through a single dominant power, rather than a patchwork of khanates. At the same time, the lure of the sea grows stronger. Portuguese navigators, driven by the search for direct access to Indian spices, round the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 under Bartolomeu Dias, and reach Calicut in 1498 under Vasco da Gama. Spanish ships, backed by Genoese capital, crossed the Atlantic in 1492 and soon established Pacific routes to Manila. Dutch and English companies follow in the 16th and 17th centuries. These maritime paths bypass the old overland bottlenecks entirely. Silk, porcelain, and tea can now reach Europe by ship from Guangzhou or Malacca, loaded in larger quantities and at lower risk than any camel caravan could manage. Spices arrive fresher and cheaper from the Malabar coast. The overland route does not disappear. Local and regional trade continues, and luxury items like rhubarb or musk still travel by land. But the long-distance, high-volume exchange shifts decisively to the ocean. The ancient glow dims slowly. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara remain important markets, but their role shrinks to regional hubs. Kashgar and Dunhuang lose traffic as Ming border controls tighten. The caravanserais stand half empty, some are abandoned. The Silk Road, once the world's longest thread of connection, becomes a collection of shorter, quieter segments. Empires still rise and fall along its length, but none again matches the Mongol scale or the Tang openness. So, as shadows lengthen over those fractured highways, a final caravan moves west under a cold sky. The camels plod through dust that once carried heavenly horses and papal envoys alike. Somewhere far to the south, sails catch the trade winds, carrying the same goods faster and farther than any land route ever could. The old path lingers in memory, a quiet line across the map, no longer the main artery but still there waiting, perhaps, for another age to rediscover it. As that final caravan plods west under a cold sky, and the ancient overland glow fades into shorter, quieter segments, the physical road begins to recede from daily use. Yet something else remains. The journeys do not vanish entirely. They settle into memory, carried in the words of those who made them, and in the objects they left behind. Two travelers in particular stand out for the clarity and detail they preserved. Xuanzang in the 7th century, and Ibn Battuta in the 14th. Their accounts, written centuries apart, became the threads that later generations would use to stitch the past back together. Xuanzang was a Chinese Buddhist monk born in 602 CE near Luoyang. By his 20s, he had already mastered the sutras available in China, but he grew restless with the incomplete and sometimes contradictory translations. In 629, defying an imperial ban on private travel abroad, he slipped out of Chang'an alone, disguised as a commoner. He crossed the Gobi by night to avoid patrols, nearly died of thirst near Turfan, and was detained for a time by the Khan of the Eastern Turks. Eventually, he reached India, spending 16 years studying at Nalanda and other centers, collecting manuscripts, debating philosophy, and visiting sacred sites. On his return in 645, he brought back 657 texts packed on 20 horses. Emperor Taizong of Tang welcomed him, built a translation bureau, and let him spend the rest of his life rendering Sanskrit into Chinese. His travel record, Great Tang Records on the Western regions, describes cities, kings, climates, customs, and Buddhist sites with a precision that still guides archaeologists. He mapped routes, measured distances in Lai, noted languages and coinage. Without his book, much of 7th century Central Asia and northern India would be blank to us. 4 centuries later, in 1325, a young Moroccan scholar named Ibn Battuta set out from Tangier on pilgrimage to Mecca. He never stopped. Over the next 29 years, he traveled more than 75,000 miles across North Africa, the Middle East, Anatolia, the Black Sea, the Golden Horde, Constantinople, India, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and China. He served as a Qadi in Delhi, survived shipwreck, married and divorced several times, and met sultans, Sufis, and merchants. His Rila, dictated to a scribe in Fez after his return, describes the Silk Road world at its late medieval stage. The caravanserais of Persia, the markets of Tabriz, the court of the Golden Horde, the ports of Hormuz. He crossed Central Asia twice, once east to Beijing under Mongol rule, once west after the Black Death. His account is less systematic than Xuanzang's but richer in human detail. The smell of bread in a Bukhara bakery, the etiquette of a Khan's tent, the fear of bandits on lonely stretches. Together, these two men left the most vivid eyewitness portraits of the road in its prime and in its twilight. Their words survived in libraries and manuscripts, copied and recopied. But the physical traces the cities half buried in sand, the cave temples, the ruined caravanserais, waited longer for rediscovery. In the 19th century, European scholars and explorers began to arrive in Central Asia, driven by curiosity, imperial competition, and the new science of archaeology. The great game between Britain and Russia brought surveyors and spies to the region, but also serious researchers. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-born British officer, conducted expeditions between 1900 and 1916, excavating at Dunhuang, Khotan, and Turfan. He removed thousands of manuscripts from the sealed library cave at Mogao texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and more, and sent them to London, Delhi, and Beijing. Albert von Lecoq and the German Turfan expeditions uncovered wall paintings and manuscripts in the northern oases. Paul Pelliot from France secured another large cache from Dunhuang. Russian explorers like Nikolai Przewalski and later Sergei Oldenburg mapped sites in the Pamirs and Fergana. These men were not always careful by modern standards. Many artifacts left their original contexts, but their work revealed the scale of the exchange. Buddhist frescoes showing Iranian and Indian influences, Nestorian crosses beside Chinese inscriptions, Sogdian letters mentioning trade debts. It was in this same period that the name Silk Road was born. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen first used the term Seidenstraße in 1877, in a lecture and later in his multi-volume China, Ergebnisse eigener Reisen und darauf gegründete Studien. He meant it as a collective label for the network of trade routes that had carried Chinese silk to the Mediterranean from roughly the 2nd century BCE onward. The phrase caught on quickly. By the early 20th century, it appeared in maps, books, and popular articles. What had been a set of practical paths used, taxed, fought over, abandoned, became an idea, a romantic symbol of ancient globalization, cultural fusion, and human connection across vast distances. The term was never precise. There was no single road, no continuous pavement, no official name in antiquity. Yet Silk Road captured something real. The long, slow movement of goods, beliefs, technologies, and people that linked distant civilizations without any of them fully understanding the whole. It turned scattered trails into a concept that could be studied, taught, and imagined. Today we speak of the Maritime Silk Road, the Southern Silk Road, even digital Silk Roads, all borrowing the original metaphor. In the end, the Silk Road is less a route on a map than a story we tell about ourselves. About curiosity that outlasts empires. About objects and ideas that travel farther than their makers ever could. Xuanzang's manuscripts still sit in museums. Ibn Battuta's words are still read. The caves at Mogao still hold their painted walls. The paths themselves have quieted, covered by sand or pavement or time, but the idea lingers. It reminds us that even in the longest nights of separation, a few determined travelers can keep the light moving between worlds. And so, as the fire dies down and the night grows still, we leave the road behind, not as a place to walk anymore, but as something carried inside, a quiet memory of how far strangers once reached toward one another. Thank you for listening tonight. Sleep well.